So tonight's talk has two speakers. Although they are Streatham residents, they are very much experts in their own right. So firstly, we are going to be hearing from Maurizio Marinelli. Maurizio is the Professor of Chinese Development Planning at the Bartlett University of College London, and he's also held academic positions in Chinese studies across Italy, the United States, China and Hong Kong, Australia, and in the United Kingdom. And his work, well, it makes interdisciplinary sound not just a jargon word, but a whole range of areas of Chinese history, culture, geography, heritage and sustainable development. He's the author of 7 books and a widely range of publishing. I'm not going to say more because I think we'd still be here for quite a while yet. And then our second speaker is Magalie Degioanni. She's a licensed acupuncturist and a general practitioner who offers holistic, heart-led care, which is rooted in the principles of Chinese medicine. And with this foundation in both classical Chinese and modern approaches, she bridges Eastern wisdom with a Western understanding. She's also, unusually for people with a European background, a fluent speaker of Mandarin Chinese, and therefore brings that broader knowledge of Chinese medical and broader culture. So I'm looking forward to hearing from both of them on the subject of when China came to Streatham. If you can show your appreciation. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mark Berry because he was instrumental in organizing this talk tonight. We had a conversation when we were walking in Tutankhamun with our dogs a few times, because when I moved to Streatham, I realized that in the Chinese sources, in the Chinese encyclopedia, there was some information about Streatham that I found very relevant, and then I decided to research. So there are a few threads that link China to Streatham. One of them actually is in the talk by John Brown that he gave on the 25th of May 2022 and is available on YouTube. John Brown was talking about the Thrall Hall Hotel that in the 1960s, under the last owner, Miss Campbell, was sold to the Chinese embassy. And so the Chinese embassy had staff, engineers, living here in Streatham before the site became what it is now, here on the Mitcham Lane, the Campbell, what is it called? The Campbell, close, yeah. And this is the first thread that I find quite interesting, you know, this presence of Chinese engineers in Streatham in the 1970s. The second thread relates to Lao She, who is a very important Chinese writer. And the third thread relates to what Magalie will talk about later, to Chinese medicine and acupuncture, long-standing tradition here in Streatham. First of all, what was a Chinese writer doing in Streatham 100 years ago, and how did he end up in Streatham of all places? And many of you might be asked, what is an Italian in Streatham? Here, talking about a Chinese writer who was in Streatham 100 years ago. And this is the kind of information that I found. As you can see in this slide here, I found in a Chinese source this piece of information that Lao She, this very important Chinese writer, had lived in Streatham on number 13 Montreal Road, which is very close to Streatham Hill, for a very short period of time. And I will come back to this later. But first of all, who was Lao She? Lao She was born, he's a pen name, for the Chinese person called, his original name was Su Qingchun, and he was born in Beijing in 1899, and is now widely regarded as one of the most important writers of 20th century Chinese literature and the key architect of Chinese literary modernism. He grew up in a very poor Manchu family, so non-Han Chinese, but Manchu. We are at the end of the Qing dynasty, 1644-1911, in Beijing's Tartar cities, because the Manchu had to live in the Tartar part of the city. And he experienced at first hand the legacies of the foreign invasion. His father died during the Boxers' uprising, during the repression of the Boxers' uprising in 1901, when he was only 2 years old. And he also experienced social dislocation and ethnic discrimination that shaped the late Qing period. The Qing dynasty came to an end in 1911, some scholars say 1912, and the beginning of the Republican period. What is very interesting is that notwithstanding his difficulties, his family difficulties, the loss of the father, he studied and he managed to excel at Peking Normal School, and he ended up working as a headmaster. And then he came of age intellectually in the period that goes under the name of the May 4th movement and New Cultural Movement. This is a moment in China between 1916 and 1926 in which China is really trying to understand how to modernize itself from the point of view of culture, from the point of view of language, not only from the point of view of technology and military technology after what happened in the second half of the 19th century with the Opium Wars and the foreign invasions of China. So what is very interesting is that this is the time actually when Lao She ended up coming to London. He left China for London in 1924 to take up a lecturership in colloquial Chinese language at the School of Oriental Studies, what is now called SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. You can see a picture here on the left-hand side. It was at the time by Finsbury Circus, and this is the library card. The library card is very important because Lao She was an avid reader. He took this position to improve his English, but also to learn about English literature, and he was an avid reader of writers like Charles Dickens in particular. Charles Dickens really inspired him to write in the vernacular language and write about the social conditions of poor people in Beijing, and as we will see also in London, about his own experience in London. He also read Conrad, Joyce, and many other Western writers while he was in London. And it's interesting because I found a book the other day at UCL of the 5th lecturer of Chinese language at the School of Oriental and African Studies at that point. And it's very interesting because all of them are really trying to come to terms with the stereotypes about Chinese people in the UK. And one of these stereotypes, we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, is what goes under the name of the Yellow Peril, the China representing a threat for the Western civilization and more specifically for Western imperialism. So I mentioned that Charles Dickens because Lao She also is often portrayed as the China's Charles Dickens because he shares with Charles Dickens this interest in this sort of vivid urban description, sharply drawn minor characters, and humor and pathos to criticize social injustice. At the same time, their background, of course, is very different. They never met each other. So we have to take into consideration that this kind of comparisons, of course, have elements of convergence, but also elements of divergence. He lived in London between 1924 and 1929. This is a map that Magalie and I have put together. I have to acknowledge Magalie for her help. And you can really see, and he wrote a very important short story that is called My Four Landlords, that I will read a few excerpts from later. And you can really see that from the 4 different parts of London in which he lived, we can have a sort of mapping through his eyes of what London was like in the eyes of a Chinese young man at the time. So he lived, for example, he was working at the School of Oriental and African Studies, but he also lived in North London, Golders Green, And then he moved to 31 St. James Garden. There is a plaque at 31 St. James Gardens in Notting Hill. And then for a short period of time, he was in another place, and then in Streatham. In the last period of his life in London, he was in Streatham Hill, and I will come to this later. I was just saying that this is, if we try to understand, China is very present in our lives today. China in terms of financial institutions, in terms of economic exchange, in terms of students. I teach at UCL, and a lot of people call UCL University of China in London instead of University College London because of the high number of Chinese students. But if we think of the imagery that China had and East Asia had in the Western mind, 100 years ago, it was very, very different. Or maybe there are also some similarities. I mean, maybe some people still think of China as the Yellow Peril for other reasons. But the Yellow Peril, and I put here two books. One is related to Fu Manchu, this supervillain, and also his daughter, the Dragon Lady, are all stereotypes, very derogatory, very negative stereotypes of Chinese people, Chinese citizens, that are condensing somehow the Western fears of this racial otherness, and also this idea of sexual danger, for example, that we can see in the next slide. Broken Blossoms, 1919, that was adapted from Thomas Burke's Limehouse Nights, often foregrounded the figure of the Chinese man alongside the endangered white woman. So this is the kind of climate that Lao She was experiencing when he came to London. And at the same time, this turmoil, this transformation in China after, if you think of the end of the First Opium War, 1842, all the way to his 1920s, when he was coming of age. This is the time in which China is also trying to find answers. 1921 in China is the time when the Chinese Communist Party was founded. So, of course, this is his relationship with London and his relationship with the English culture is particularly interesting because he's really trying to come to terms, on the one hand, with the stereotypes in the West, and on the other hand, with this transformation that was occurring in China at the time. His contribution, this is the plaque that I mentioned before, that is from his lodging in Notting Hill. We don't have a plaque at number 13 Montreal Road, Streatham Hill, as yet. Maybe one day we should put it there. Why his experience in London is particularly important. In London, he wrote 3 of his most important novels or pieces of writing. One is more of a philosophical kind of take, but the Two Ma, or Mr. Ma and Son, as it is translated in English, is probably one of the most interesting pieces of his literature, and is a sort of interesting example of literary modernism, and also, as I was saying before, of bringing this kind of Dickensian, Charles Dickens style into the Chinese literature for the first time. This is the story that, of course, is autobiographical, is a story of a father and son who, because of the death of the brother, of the father's brother, they ended up coming to London to take on, to run an antique shop near St. Paul's Cathedral. And through what we could call a minister or a missionary, they ended up lodging with a widow and her daughter. And inevitably, they ended up falling in love with both of them. The father, of course, fell in love with the widow, and the son fell in love with the daughter. And this leads to a series of misunderstandings and a series of rejections in the end. But at the same time, in Mr. Ma and Son, we have a depiction of the Chinese community in Limehouse. That community that, as I was showing you before, was considered so scary and such a threat for from the point of view of the British imagination of China at the time. I will probably read a couple of excerpts. So this is from Mr. Ma and Son, and it's quite an interesting excerpt to give you an idea of his way of writing, and then I will come to My Four Landlords. So here you can really see already his style. He's describing Minister Evans. He said, Minister Evans has been a missionary in China for over 20 years. He's knowledgeable about things Chinese, from the prehistoric age to Yuan Shikai's ascension to the throne, an event he loves to hear about. This is the time when Yuan Shikai was the first president of the Republic of China. After 3 years, decided to be an emperor instead of a president, in line with the Chinese tradition. And then Lao She continues, Minister Evans knows them all. His mastery of the Chinese tongue still leaves much to be desired. But apart from this, he could almost be called a walking encyclopedia on China. He loves the Chinese wholeheartedly. On sleepless nights, he would pray to God that China be soon turned into a British colony. Then, with tears in his eyes, he will say to God, if the Chinese did not come under British rule soon, this yellow-faced, dark-haired race can never make it to heaven. And of course, you can see here humor, satire, pathos, the kind of Dickensian style, but of course applied to a different context. The next excerpt, actually we are coming to Streatham, because the next excerpt that I want to read is from the short story called My Four Landlords. And here he describes the first landlord when he first arrived in London. There is a longer description of his only friend actually in London, that was Mr. Egerton, and he helped Mr. Egerton to translate the Chimping May, or Golden Lotus, that is one of the most important novels of the Ming period. So that was the first translation. And then in the final part, it says, after leaving the Egertons, Mr. Egerton has a very complicated family menage with 2 wives who ended up becoming friends, but not at the beginning, of course. And then he was a heavy drinker. And in the end, he said, when I was living with Mr. Egerton, if I paid the rent, he would provide the meals. That was the kind of arrangement. So he wasn't really a landlord. It was more of a friend, sub-landlord, kind of spare room kind of business. And then he comes to Streatham, and as you can see here in Streatham, he lived with the Dolmans family. This, of course, is difficult to know the exact name because the novel is written in Chinese, and a short story is written in Chinese, and I translated it, but more or less because Chinese is kind of the transliteration of the characters could be Dolman. Somebody else said that it could be Darman, but it's difficult to tell. And here is describing Mr. Dolman and Mrs. Dolman and the daughter. And it's quite an interesting account if you read it here, because he says, for example, as for Mr. Dolman, as for what the old man, Mr. Dolman, did for a living, I still do not know. First, I lived there only half a year. Second, the English do not like to discuss private matters. Third, Mr. Dolman did not like to talk. So he's really giving this kind of snapshots of his experience in the house. And then there is an interesting take on Mr. Dolman's always telling 3 stories, having 3 continuous stories. Mrs. Dolman is portrayed as an avid reader of the advertisement in the Mornington Post, and the daughter is seen as, he says, she was somewhat depressed, with no boyfriend to take her out. She would often pretend to have a headache after dinner and go upstairs to bed. In that economically depressed country, that was the time in the late 1920s, 1929, of the Depression, marriage was truly an insoluble problem. I feared she would be stuck at home forever. And then there is this strange take here, because he said the landlord's daughter often becomes the wife of a foreign student, good material for a kind of semi-historical novel. In truth, the meaning behind it goes far beyond the frivolity of foreign students alone. And so he's really revealing this kind of him trying to come to terms, trying to understand the English society at the time. I want to conclude with an interesting point, because he's also quite critical of the way in which, so he's trying to break these stereotypes, but he's also quite critical of his own, of the Chinese way of looking. He's also quite critical in his novel about this, what we could say, the Chinese attitude towards the possibility of adapting to the outside world, the failure to adapt to this changing world in China. And there is a line here in the previous slide. Yes, it says, if you want to overthrow imperialism, you have to start by acquiring knowledge. Shouting slogans will lead you nowhere. This is also in Mr. Mind's Son. So I just want to say that he's offering this kind of insights into his experience of London at the time, but he's also, since the novels were all written in Chinese, and then he continued to write, of course, in Chinese, Rickshaw Boy, there are many other novels that I would strongly recommend to read, are really indicative also of his attempt to live between these two worlds. And this had an impact, had a terrible impact on his life, because then he also lived in Singapore, he was also a professor in Shandong University, he also lived in the United States, and when the Cultural Revolution started in 1966 in China, he was harshly criticized as a capitalist roader, as a reactionary element, and he ended up drowning in a lake in mysterious circumstances. Nobody knows if he drowned by accident or he was murdered. On this note, I will hand it over to Magalie to talk about something more cheerful, probably, than my final line. Thank you for your attention.
I'm not as tall as Maurizio, so I'll have to drop this a little bit. Okay. Wow, looking at the room from here is a completely different angle. Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you, Maurizio. That was a great introduction. So what I'm going to be talking about is going to be leading on from this history of what Lao She has initially initiated in Streatham and how this has evolved into today. Because what strikes me most about Lao She is how he has observed just ordinary life. He spent his time in the UK observing not only London, but also observing Streatham, and then as a result of his experiences here, writing stories in his own personal manner. He observed not just politics and literature, but he also observed how people eat, how people work, how people live, how people suffer with their own worries and health. And Chinese medicine begins in a very similar way. We observe by really looking at everyone's ordinary life. So, although society has changed since Lao She's time, over 100 years ago, actually the way that we still live and the things that we still suffer from are quite similar to back then. We are still tired, we are still stressed, we are still disconnected, we still have health issues which can be maybe age-related or not, but they're still very much existent today. And that observation is what first drew me towards Chinese medicine. Now, when I grew up in Streatham. I was raised in Streatham. I am a Streatham girl through and through. And I have seen over the years the strengths and limitations of mainly the medical system, because that was always my interest, and also the educational system, because for a long time I worked as a teacher in schools, in Streatham libraries, Norbury libraries, and teaching kids and groups English and English literature. And in some ways, I find that my journey mirrors a little bit Lao She's, but just in reverse, where Lao She traveled from China to London and then eventually settled in Streatham for a long time. I found myself drawn from Streatham eastwards. I went a bit more towards China, and I found myself drawn to their Eastern way of life, their philosophy, and particularly their way of addressing health through daily life, what they can do on a daily basis to keep themselves well and prevent any kind of disease and issues. And this is where, before I went into that, I was an English teacher. And I worked with children of all ages, from primary all the way up to university level. And I would create these little groups and teach them really the beauty of English language and what that meant. Because at heart, I am a linguist, and I've learned 4 languages over time, which has not only benefited me through my teaching, but also benefited me through Chinese medicine. And this is what I will explain today as well. So when I initially started to change careers, I thought, oh, I would leave analyzing books behind. But in the end, I realized I started actually analyzing people. And the language actually brought me a lot of help. In English, we have words like, oh, I can't stomach it anymore. And to stomach something means to be able to digest something, to be able to say, well, you know what, I can handle it. Or I don't have the heart to do it. It means that you can't actually emotionally feel that you can deal with this situation and it's going to affect you. Or you can even say to, I don't know, a young teenager today, you've really got gall, right? And this gallbladder, this emotion that comes from this organ means that you have the boldness to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do if you didn't have that power. And we have that in other languages. In French, we have, I don't know if anyone speaks French in the room, but we have the word for wrist, which is poignet. And poignet can be split into 2 words, poids and nier. Now, where nier could be sometimes sold as a joint, but the poids means a weight, okay? So I'll give you an example. I had a young child, she was about 5 years old, come to see me in my clinic, and she had a rash on her wrists, just her wrists. And they thought it was eczema, and that's kind of how it was presented. And the mother was going a bit despair because she wasn't sure what more she could do. And the doctors gave her steroid cream, but you know, for a child, you have to be careful. So when I started speaking to the little girl, I asked her, when did this start, and what is it exactly that she may think has caused this? And she looked at me and she said, I don't know. And so I said to her, is there anything that you feel that is maybe stressing you or burdening you or making you feel like you can't handle it anymore? And she looked at me and she said, my mum and dad sometimes. And I said, why your mum and dad? And then she looked at her mum. And I said to her, would you like mum to stay or would you like mum to leave? And I spoke to the mother beforehand, and the mother had said that, you know, she's happy to let the little one speak freely if she wanted to, so she's happy to leave. And the little girl said, no, mum can stay. It's just mum and dad shout and fight a lot. And what I found out later on is that the mother and father had decided to file for divorce. And the little girl, for the last several months that this had been going on, she had been fighting to keep mum and dad together because she couldn't bear seeing the separation happen. And this showed in her wrists. She just couldn't bear the weight of this, and she had put it on her little shoulders to deal with. So through knowing French and also through being able to understand these words, it helped me get another perspective into ailments and disease and what people may go through. And in China, we also have these terms. We have them in different words. We can even have, if I take the example of gall again, we have dada. And da means big and dan means gall. So it means you're really bold, you really dare to do something. So we can see that the language is really important, and where maybe I play with literature and language through how I diagnose and how I help people, Lao She did a similar thing, where he broke down in his own way English language and at the same time translated it and brought it into China so others could actually understand his own experiences in the UK. So a good teacher, in my opinion, is always a learner first, and that eventually gave me enough curiosity and confidence to dive into Chinese medicine, which has then led me to meet someone that many of you may know, Dr. Ying. Now, if we look out that window, we will see Dr. Ying's Streatham Chinese clinic, which I'm sure a lot of you have passed by day in, day out, or maybe some of you have even visited. Now, when Dr. Ying first arrived here, I was about 5 years old, And I had gone to visit him. My father had taken me because I had sleeping issues, and I was 5, so bedtime was not exactly my favorite time of the day, but I also was extremely hyper. And Dr. Ying had helped me with some massage and then eventually had given me treatment. When I grew enough confidence, he gave me some acupuncture, but that really worked. And in speaking with his wife, which is the receptionist, she saw my passion for languages and she offered me to teach me Chinese. And so for 4 years after that, I would sit there every Saturday morning and I would learn Chinese while she was preparing herbs and she was sending people in and out of the clinic rooms. But while I was there, I saw how patients changed. I saw how patients would come in miserable and sad and then walk out with a bit more of a smile and some hope that actually finally they're being listened to about their problems. Or that they'd come in with a limp and then suddenly walk out with their whole foot on the floor. And it was mesmerizing because I saw the dedication and care that someone could bring that was different to the medicine that we tend to know today. So, a bit of patience, observation of ordinary life, and creating of a relationship with people can help you understand. And this is something that Lao She tries to teach also through his work. So growing up between these cultures gave me a slightly different role, or at least I picked up something that I could do, because I often found that there was misunderstandings. There was misunderstanding when you didn't get the language. There was misunderstandings when you didn't understand what someone was trying to say. And it creates a barrier. And this is what I wanted to try and do, because I saw that I could, in growing up here, I could bridge the two cultures. I could bridge East and West and make Chinese medicine accessible. And as we can see, Chinese influence in Streatham isn't only in literature, but it's also in healing. So what actually is Chinese medicine? Chinese medicine is where we look at the whole person. We don't just look at you and we think, okay, you're just a person, you're hearing, like we see in standard medical care. Unfortunately today, it's either on the phone or we see you in for 10 minutes, and then based on what happens, we narrow you down to a checklist of symptoms, and then, you get passed on from Peter to Paul. In Chinese medicine, it's different. We treat you as human beings that you deserve to be treated as. So what that means is that we look at everything. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. I look at how you sleep. I look at your digestion, your bowel movements. I look at your energy levels. I look at your emotions. I look at the pain that you may be carrying and what that may mean. And then I look at your lifestyle. Because your health is not just your own. It is affecting the person who loves you the most. It is affecting the next generation. And most importantly, it is affecting yourself and your daily life. So that deserves to be changed, at least in my opinion. So when I do this, I often try to describe myself as a Chinese medicine GP. I want to get everything that I can to be able to help you. I don't just look at what hurts. I look at why it hurts, because that is the key. It's not good enough to just say, oh, I've got shoulder pain, and then just treat the shoulder pain. What does that shoulder pain actually mean? Where does that shoulder pain come from? And only then, if I get the root cause, can I actually treat the problem properly. So we're interested very much in the wider picture, which brings me to why people come to see me. People come to see me for all kinds of problems. You'd be very much surprised of what a little needle can do or some herbs can do. I've got people who come to me for infertility. I've got people who come to me for joint inflammation and arthritis. I've got people who come to me for incontinence, for menstrual issues. I've got people who come to me for low energy, insomnia, stress, and pain. The amount of pain I see people in a week, it's saddening. But at least I'm happy to say that I get to see them better on a weekly basis, and that's more than enough for me. So when someone says that, they come to Chinese medicine, it's sadly often the last resort, I'm sad to say. I eventually become one's first resort after I've treated them, but most of the time, that's it. Like, you have to rescue me, or I have no idea what to do with myself anymore. They go to the GP, they've had lots of blood tests, they've seen lots of doctors and medications, they've tried and tested, but unfortunately something has gotten lost along the way. And that's, a part of me feels is that because we've lost that medical personal approach. And, you know, with the NHS, they're doing so much, but with the amount of people that are struggling every day, it's very hard to actually achieve those numbers. When I worked in hospitals and all that, you have like 10 minutes per person, and then after that, you've got to go. So I can understand where they're coming from and the struggle, but that doesn't mean that you're on your own and that there's no one here that can help you. There's people like me, there's people like Dr. Ying, and there's many others probably in London and in the general vicinity that can do that as well. So the difference is very much not what, but why, and where does it come from? People want to be treated as human beings, not as a collection of symptoms. So how do we actually help? How do I actually work? Well, I work with these elements, mainly acupuncture, because I find it very useful and very quick, and also it doesn't taste as bad as a bag of bitter herbs, so you just come in, lay down, relax for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then after that you're on your way, most of the time feeling better than when you came in. Otherwise, I do herbs and supplements, and this is something that will normally help to boost the internal system, and this is how we can also treat the internal disease. After that, I look into your lifestyle. What is it that maybe is you're doing that could be affecting you? Is it the way you sleep? Is it the time that you eat, the way that you eat, how you exercise? There's so many questions. And these little things that you may think are not that important are actually the most important to me. After that, I look at your nutrition and I look at your balance. I look to see how things are working in the system, and I try to bring you back to balance. I had a case of a 93-year-old man. He's by far my oldest patient and my most enthusiastic and optimistic patient so far. He had, in brief, throughout his life 4 cancers, a major car accident that had rendered him paralyzed if he didn't have the stubbornness that I had seen in a man to get himself out of a wheelchair and walking again. He suffered from other diseases which I will not name, but those that have rendered him in bed, in a coma. And yet today he's 93, determined to live to 136. So he's told me that I have to help him get there. And now he's almost 94. And when I came to meet him, he was struggling with what was left of what he picked up from the hospital. So he had been told that he's in remission, and that now he's just left with this severe cough and cold. He was, there wasn't one word that he couldn't say without coughing afterwards. And he would cough terribly. He'd be coughing and spitting, and there'd be phlegm. Then he'd have swollen legs that were probably the size of 2 of my arms put together, red, hot, so the edema was very strong. He had poor indigestion. He didn't sleep at night. He would scream to the point where the neighbors next door thought that he was being attacked nightly, until the wife went next door to clarify the situation. And it was to a point where they were in despair. The doctors had done test after test, and they had found nothing. He was surprisingly healthy for someone after 4 cancers and in remission. So what do you do then? So they called me, and I went, and I did a house visit because he was bedridden. And I listened to his case, I listened to what happened, and then what I did is I did a treatment with just acupuncture. And in half an hour, I removed the needles, and he went downstairs where he normally sits in his chair, and we didn't hear a sound from him for the next half an hour while I treated his wife. And she got worried because she thought, uh-oh, that's it. What have you done? And I was like, no, this cannot be me. He must be just sleeping. But when we went downstairs, he was watching TV, and he was like, oh, hello. And we were like, you're not coughing. And he was like, yeah, I'm not coughing, and I don't have the need to cough. And that was something that made me realize the miracle of acupuncture, because in moments it can work so incredibly fast. And I see that with children as well. Children, I just put a needle in and out. I don't even leave it, because they respond so quickly. So since then I had done treatments on him, and after 7 treatments, he not only had not coughed again, his bronchitis had disappeared, his edema had gone down to the point where I told him, as a 93-year-old, he could easily, if there was a 90s modeling magazine, he could easily model his legs, because they looked great, right? He had no heart palpitations, his indigestion had cleared, he had barely any phlegm left, and his sleep from the screaming had gone down to just subtle moaning around 2 a.m. So that meant that his wife also could finally get some shut-eye after 4 years. And that also then meant that he felt better and he was not panicking. And then, of course, he had more confidence that he would live until he's 136. So, bringing me back to this is how I work. They are just tools, but the real goal is really balance, is how I work with you. And this is very much what we do. So from here, we come to a century of connection. We realize that a century ago, Lao She came to Streatham trying to understand Britain and its people. And today, these Chinese traditions continue to find a place here in different forms. At first, we have had Lao She and how everything he had done in Britain, he had taught at SOAS, he had observed British life, he had made books, and he had become the Chinese Charles Dickens. And eventually, all of that had brought Streatham into a new light and at the same time our today's society and enriched our history. In the early 2000s, Dr. Ying had opened his practice and has served the Streatham community for about 20 years now. And then today, I also continue this healing tradition where I want to bring East and West together and offer personalized healing to anyone who comes to my clinic. And today, this is where we all realize that actually one of the beautiful things about local history is that cultural exchange doesn't only happen in museums or books. It is actually sometimes something that lives quietly in our neighborhoods, something that lives amongst all of us through our generations, through our conversation and our everyday acts of care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. We do have time for a few questions if anybody does have some questions. Tim, at the back.
Of the relationship with China, one theme to look at is missionaries. And Streatham had a lot of Methodist churches, there was a London Missionary Society, and there was, if you look at press cuttings from sort of 1905 onwards, there was a lot of talks that people came to in Streatham, which was understanding Chinese life from missionaries that came back to their original church. So that might be worth looking at. The second question is, sorry, more a question really. When was the first Chinese restaurant in Streatham?
Dragon at the bottom of the dip. Whether that was the first Chinese restaurant,
When was that?
that would have been in 1965, something like that, 60s, 65. It was a Dragon at the very bottom of the dip. Okay. So whether that was the first one, I don't know.
And on the missionaries, actually, Lao She is also talking about some of his students when he was teaching at the School of Oriental Studies, and some of them actually were missionaries. But there is a long tradition, of course, of from Matteo Ricci, in China during the Ming period, and that's the Jesuits and so there is a long tradition. I didn't know specifically about Streatham, but there was also a center point because there was a student who wanted to study. I found something in a Chinese source that says an English student wants to study Chinese medicine, want to study Chinese language with Lao She because he was interested in Chinese medicine. And Lao She said, I don't know the terminology. I don't know the terminology for Chinese medicine because it's quite specialistic. And his Professor Johnson, who was the head of department at the time, was not very happy that he was rejecting a student. But he was also teaching to, he mentions, different office people were working in offices, people were working in different kind of sectors as well.
Thank you. I think that's actually quite important to say that there are reports, I think, in the local papers from quite a lot of sources of not just missionaries, but other people kind of reporting in sort of genuinely interested terms of their experience in China, and that there was sort of an appreciation of Chinese culture, and not just what you sort of see from the popular press, that, as we mentioned, the novels of that time of the Yellow Peril. And although perhaps we're more aware of Britain having a Japan mania from the 1890s, I think there was an equal interest in, you might be tinged with what we now call an Orientalist approach of it being exotic and therefore something strange and weird, not appreciated in the same way as other things. It was nevertheless, there were people who were, I'm sure I've seen a report, there was somebody had a very famous Chinese garden in Streatham. I don't have any, John, if you can recall anything about that one, as a very early Chinese garden rather than a Japanese garden.
Chinese tea house before the First World War down in the dip, opposite the triangle, that was quite novel. I have read, although I have not been able to prove, that the first Chinese restaurant in London outside of Chinatown was in Streatham High Road. It was definitely one of the earliest, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it was the earliest.
No. So I think it's fascinating areas still for lots of research to take place. Any more questions in the room?
Thank you very much. Roger Garside. I first came across Lao She, or rather the memory of Lao She, when I was on my first diplomatic posting in Beijing during the Cultural Revolution, a time when many writers suffered and many intellectuals suffered the same fate as Lao She. Well, may I thank you both very much indeed, for I came to Streatham from China in the sense that I knew China before I knew Streatham. But you have brought the two together in two excellent talks tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
This may be a really weird. What's the history of Chinese medicine? I mean, how far back? How did it start? Who would have thought of putting a pin into somebody, making them feel better?
So I'm just going to try and hope that the other microphone might work to give us more flexibility.
Yeah, okay, great. That's a very good question. The history of Chinese medicine, you can go back as far as over 5,000 years ago, but there is actually more recent discovery that shows that there are way older archaeology findings of more recent. And I remember being in a Chinese medicine conference about 3 years ago where they had found something, a doll, that had the meridians etched on it over 5,000 years ago, and this is what brought something completely new to the table. And it was actually one of the main parts of the conference because obviously everyone was interested to see what that looked like. And where on the body we have meridians, and if you don't know what that means, is essentially along these lines that go from your toe or your tips of your fingers all the way into the center of your chest where your organs lie. They are almost like, you can think of them as reflex points. If I am to press on one, I will probably know what organ that's linked to and where the disease may be. Is it really in the organ, or are we still safe and it's further away but it's heading in that direction? Now, the dummy that had been found was shown the meridians in a different way to what we see them today, and at least more diverse and actually more correct anatomically. And that's purely because the Chinese refused to cut open people because they found that as the greatest sin. So they only learned anatomy through war zones and what had actually come out of people as a result of barbaric natures, let's say. But there is more to that because the reason why they discovered of sticking a pin, well, before that, they wouldn't have done that because they wouldn't have had needles. What they would have had is sticks. They would have had really, really sharp sticks. That there is a herb called zao ci, which is actually a very, very important herb in Chinese medicine, and it has these, yes, thorns, thank you very much. They have thorns, and these thorns, when sharpened, because they were quite strong and resilient, what they would do is they would be able to prick those, and most often it would lead to bleeding. And then eventually they realized that bleeding someone, although it's very small, can make them more weak, more deficient. So they devised different ways where there's a special stone that they would carve. And they would carve, and they would carve, and they would carve. And what ended up happening is that everyone that had that would get acupuncture, which was mainly the empirical family, because to do those stones took decades, they would have their own set. And so any time that the family got sick, the physicians would bring in their own set and they would treat them, and they would treat them where they would keep the needle in because the needle would be quite thick, and so as a result it wouldn't actually be able to stand there on its own. And that would be what I would call very painful acupuncture. Today, our needles are hair thin and they're disposable, so it's entirely hygienic. And when we put them in, a lot of the time you don't even feel that you put them in because they're as thin as your hair. So what made them think? It's a very good question. A lot of the time it's through palpation. Chinese people were observists. They were really, you can see the way that they came up with their own language is by observing life and then drawing it out. So by doing that and drawing it, then they realize, well, the body also has signs. Why does it get red spots? Why does it get this? And when you look at how the characters are formed, it's very much to mimic exactly what the body's going through. And through understanding nature, that if you've got red, it may mean heat, so we need to cool you down. Or that means we need to make the blood come out, so that will bring the heat out, so they would bleed. When it's cold, there's no blood, everything's stuck, we leave it in. You know, they formulated something ingenious through life observation. And then that's how needles came about, massage later on, and then, of course, herbs further down. I hope that answers your question.
In which case, all that remains for me to do is to ask you to show your appreciation to our two speakers this evening. Thank you.